A manifesto. Post-human child. Decolonizing childhood through reconfiguring the human. Key to understanding the notion of post-human child as a lever to decolonize education is the pervasive adult conception of temporality in education that takes development and progress as inevitable. Time is like an arrow pointing towards a future that is more progressed, further developed, and extinguishing childhood. There is no time to be intensely immersed in an event. This holds both for nations as it does for children. In education, we talk about school readiness and developmental appropriate practice, a still dominant developmental orientation informed in particular by Piaget's theory of cognitive development that claims to be both natural and universal, but is in fact normative. It assumes that humans develop individually and innately, according to general laws, through clearly identifiable irreversible stages until the child is capable of abstract, rational, logical thought and is mature psychologically, socially, and biologically. The norm of this linear maturation process is an adult who is white, middle class, male, heterosexual, and able-bodied, the root cause of structural exploitation, dehumanization of women, sexualized, racialized, and naturalized others, and asymmetrical violence. For post-structuralists and critical post-humanists, the human is clearly a political category, although interestingly and of concern, age is not included yet as a category of discrimination. Even the children's rights discourse is developmental. The United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child assumes that the end goal of childhood is the formation of an adult citizen competent and capable of living individually and contributing productively to a Western-style liberal democracy. The adult, with a capital I, is the accepted valued norm, and child, therefore, as a lesser, still maturing adult in the making. Child as small I, childish, less competent, and less useful. For example, Article 12 of the Convention states that children do not have full autonomy and that their ability to form and express their opinion develops with age and maturity. Developmentalism is a recapitulation theory. Child's intellectual development is compared with, recapitulates, the development of the species, with the child as nature as the origin of the species. See, for example, Darwin, from savage to civilized. This process of racial differentiation underlies our modern understanding of child and is used as justification to treat children as intellectual and emotional primitives. According to the recapitulation theory, children's conceptual understanding evolves from concrete to abstract and simple to more complex, and it is assumed that full understanding across phases in a life cycle is not possible, because the differences between child, savage, and the adult are not just differences of degree, but of kind. Child is an ontological other. Child is the marginalized property of the adult, economically disenfranchised with no right to work or own property, a description that is also applied to indigenous peoples. Moreover, as for example Cecil Rhodes put it darkly, the native is to be treated as a child, which for Ashish Nandi does not only express racism, but an ideology that sees childhood as the logic of colonialism. As ontological other, it is assumed the child lacks the capacity for choice and moral agency. Like the insane and the criminal, child is confined in institutions, suffers from mental humiliation, harsh punishments, constant surveillance, and a complete lack of academic freedom. Since orality was replaced by literacy in the printed word, child has become an outsider to adult culture. Children are segregated as cultural outsiders in schools, as well as age segregated within schools. The conception of time that underpins developmentalism is chronological time, an uninterrupted flow of nows that can be measured, chronos. Time and childhood are intrinsically entangled concepts and logically connected in the lived experience of educational institutions with their clock-bound work. Childhood tends to be viewed instrumentally, mere preparation for adulthood, and ignores all the things children are indeed good at, perhaps even better at than adults. For example, expressing themselves artistically, asking philosophical questions, or learning a new language. Developmental theories assume a deficit model of childhood, whose plausibility rests on comparing children with adults primarily in terms of adult knowledge. Moreover, child is not only segregated and separated from adults spatially, for example, forced into indoor classrooms in order to learn, and into engineered recreational areas to play and socialize, child is also separated from her own selves. Cut into emotional, cognitive, and physical parts, children develop each part according to different speeds. To think about the self in this way, whether child or adult, are the still dominant Western dichotomous philosophies, in particular Plato and Descartes, and religions that assume an ontological split between the two radically different substances, mind and body, a deep dualism that characterizes modernity. It assumes that universal, timeless knowledge of the outside world is obtained from the inside of the mature, knowing adult subject, as conscious, self-aware, self-contained, independent, rational, mature, and universal. This ontology regards human as what Donna Haraway calls autopoietic systems, organizationally closed with self-produced binaries, predictable autonomous units that are centrally controlled, for example through a human will or intellect. To put it graphically, since modernity, academic work in schools as well as universities is carried out by disembodied brains on sticks. Knowledge is transmitted through language, through words, many words that represent the world out there. Learning is about the world and is seldom experiential, involving the body and the senses. The routine use of worksheets is a good example of this. Touching, smelling, or movement are rarely regarded as means to acquire, communicate, or assess knowledge that matters. In many ways, education involves the subordination and discrimination of humans who are not regarded as fully human yet. They are wild, uncivilized savages who are of nature and need culture to become civilized. Scientifically objectified as units of study, children are subjected to a sea of normative classifications and semi-medical diagnoses when they depart from the norm. Think of ADHD, autistic, bipolar, etc. The terms colonizer and colonized take on a double meaning in the context of childhood. Whether childhood is constructed as a phase in the life cycle of a human life or a species or a nation, chronological improvement to independence, autonomy, and rationality is assumed, that is, the logic and temporality of colonialism. Therefore, decolonizing childhood requires a troubling of the experience of time in education, but also truth, hence the / in decolonizing, as the latter positions children as knowledge consumers and unequal epistemic adult-child relationships. Western humanist ontology and religion have produced certain figurations of childhood with the nature-culture dichotomy as its structuring mechanism. For clarity's sake, I've created a table expressing how the binary and its entanglement with modern schooling works for adults to have power over children, how it includes and excludes. The figurations, of course, overlap. I've published this table before, but I've made an important change to it since. Although of course simplified, it should help clarify why embodied experiences in the body, read nature, have been rendered inferior to the mind, read culture, in schooling. The way we build relationships with children and are listening as adults to children has been shaped by Western ontologies and educational theories. The figuration of the developing child draws especially on ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Like an acorn, child is unfinished and incomplete by nature and therefore requires maturation and guidance from adults. The figuration of the ignorant child lacks rationality and intelligence. As empty vessel waiting to be filled, child is either ignorant because she needs experiences, see for example Aristotle and Locke, and therefore needs training, or child lacks reason, see for example Plato, and therefore needs instruction. The figuration of the Eve child's major influence is Protestantism. Child is born essentially sinful and can therefore not be trusted. The task of culture is control and discipline, as in the current meaning of disciple. The aim is to surrender one's authority to someone else, a truth outside oneself. The preferred method of teaching is inculcation. In Latin, means force upon or stamp in. Importantly, teaching is a drawing in to established systems of thought. The key influence for the figuration of the innocent child has been philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that childhood as a special time of vulnerability needs to unfold naturally with as little intervention as possible. Child is positioned as lacking responsibility and requires protection. Innocence is a white privilege and is systematically denied to brown bodies. The teacher is positioned as a facilitator of learning. The figuration of the egocentric child draws in particular on psychologist Jean Piaget. Child lacks social norms and cultural values, cannot empathize or decenter in the imagination, and requires socialization by elders and inculcation. The figuration of the fragile child rests upon psychomedical scientific models. Children are seen as vulnerable, lacking resilience, and in need of protection and medication for normalization. The fragile child lacks resilience by nature and needs culture to diagnose, protect, possibly medicate, and teachers to remediate. All figurations of child in the table assume childhood as an inferior stage in human development, with a mature, developed, rational, autonomous adult self as the normative ideal. They shape teaching, research, curriculum construction, educational policies, and often sentimentalized adult imaginaries. They frame debates about the proportional influence of nature, read biology, and nurture, read socialization, on children's development, zigzagging between the two poles, often expressed in percentages. However, there are severe problems with the cognitive framing of these figurations. For decades in the sociology of childhood, post-structuralists and postmodernists have questioned the dichotomy between nature and culture because it ignores the role of political, socio-economic power relations and the politics of cultural, racial, and gendered identities in nature realist accounts of childhood. Shifting research to matters of Foucauldian discourse and language, these scholars argue that this child, or childhood, does not exist because there are many children and many childhoods. Through their scholarship, the idea started to take root, mainly in academia, that childhood, like race, is a social construct, called social constructionism. I express this in my book, The Posthuman Child as I, small i's. Critical posthumanism takes their critique a radical ontological step further and involves an unsettling of voice and identity as something humans have, with agency as something outside the acting human body. Posthumanism invites us to reconfigure who and what the I is, as well as its relationship to the world, more akin to some indigenous knowledge systems and young children's epistemologies and form of life. Humans are part of nature culture and cannot take a transcendental, detached point of view, a view from nowhere in particular. The material discursive entanglements of agencies and processes are already at work when classifying children. Decolonization is beyond identity and individualized agency, neither in charge of nature nor of culture. Disrupting the nature-culture dichotomy cannot come from an adult merely deconstructing childhood as social construct, but requires an ontological decentering of the human. The human of whatever age is not just social, but also material, as we have seen what Haraway calls an unbounded, sympoetic system, complex, dynamic, responsive, situated, and historical. The figuration of posthuman child as I, printed in grey instead of black to express the subject as unbounded, sympoetic system, is not a doing away with or a denial that there are individual children who exist, but reconfigures the human as always already inhuman and more than human company, is inhuman in fact, already untangled with what, for example, happens on Mars and how a reading scheme measures reading abilities and the desire, for example, becoming a doctor, and the phone she's accessing WhatsApp messages with, and the chair she's sitting on, and her classroom in Vrijgrond with an ant crawling on the floor, and ad infinitum. Hence, it is impossible to trace all entanglements that are part of what makes a child act the way she does. Resisting erasures between past and futures, post-human child does not exist as a distinct entity prior to her interactions, but emerges through interactions in between the material and the discursive that constitute the subject and her agency. Cells, atoms, wind, fibers, dust, metals, skin, ant legs, soil, paper, government, concept, policies, language, touch, atmosphere, and so forth. Feminist philosopher Karen Barad's major contribution to the social sciences and the humanities has been to show how quantum physics evidences that nature and culture are always diffracted through one another as a matter of fact. Unlike the clock time of progress and developmentalism, threaded through each person is already their situated childhood as well as their future and the present. Times are bleeding through one another. Present, past, and future permeate one another as events, combinations of different times. Time is made through processes as opposed to the Newtonian idea of empty, universal time as a container for events and time as an arrow. Reconfiguring the human as nature culture and regarding child and adult as symbiotic systems inhabiting multiple temporalities and rendering each other capable is salient and urgent for intergenerational justice to come.